The chandeliers of Westwood Hall burned like captured constellations, pouring molten gold upon silk gowns and polished marble, yet no light was kind enough to spare Lady Eliana Westwood from the precision of society's gaze. She stood near the edge of the ballroom as though it were a precipice, her gloved hands folded with careful composure, her shoulders drawn back in a posture learned through years of quiet endurance. Music spiraled from the orchestra balcony, violins rising and falling like sighs too refined to be called sorrow. Around her, laughter rang in crystal notes. It was the sort of evening designed to crown the fortunate and quietly bury the unwanted. "Eliana, do try not to loom," her sister murmured, though the word carried across more ears than it was meant to. Lady Margaret Westwood shimmered beside her in crimson satin, diamonds clasped at her throat like captive stars. Margaret's smile possessed the ruthless brightness of a blade freshly honed. One would think you had been invited to your own execution. A ripple of amusement traveled through the cluster of young ladies orbiting Margaret. Eliana inclined her head, neither retreating nor retaliating. She had long ago discovered that dignity, when wielded properly, unsettled cruelty more than tears ever could. Yet dignity could not silence whispers. "Nobody wants you," Margaret added softly, adjusting the lace at Eliana's sleeve with feigned affection. "Not when there are so many unmarred hands in London." The word settled like ash. Unmarred. It was always the hands. Beneath the ivory silk of her gloves, Eliana's wrists bore the map of an old catastrophe. The scars were pale now, thin rivers twisting over fragile skin, but their history had never faded. Fire had once leapt through the nursery curtains at Westwood Manor, and a child's cry had pierced the smoke. Eliana had not hesitated. She had carried her younger brother through the choking heat while servants fled in confusion. The boy survived. The house survived. Only her skin remembered the cost. Society, however, remembered only that she had emerged altered. Across the ballroom, gentlemen appraised her with polite calculation, then looked away. Mothers steered their sons elsewhere with the slightest tightening of gloved fingers. Prospects dissolved before they had properly formed. Eliana felt the familiar narrowing of her world, as if the music itself pressed her toward the wall. The herald staff struck the marble floor 3 times. The doors at the far end of the hall opened with ceremonial gravity, and conversation broke upon a single name. His Majesty King Alaric of Norhaven. Even those who pretended indifference turned. He entered without flourish, yet the space rearranged itself around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black formal uniform edged with silver embroidery, he moved as one accustomed not merely to obedience but to scrutiny. A subtle emblem of a wolf gleamed upon his breast, its head raised in silent challenge. His dark hair was brushed back from a face carved in deliberate lines, and his eyes, keen and assessing, swept the assembly not as a supplicant to admiration but as a sovereign measuring his dominion. King Alaric had been in England scarcely a fortnight. Rumor claimed he had declined 3 advantageous alliances already, deeming them insincere. Rumor also claimed he was searching for something no courtier could define. Margaret straightened instantly, her laughter gentled into practiced allure. "Observe," she whispered to her companions, "how a king surveys his options." Eliana did not pretend he surveyed her. Why should he? She was precisely the sort of complication monarchs were trained to avoid. Still, when his gaze crossed the room, something in her pulse shifted. It was not hope. Hope had learned discretion. It was simply awareness, sharp and unwelcome. The king exchanged formal greetings with Lord Westwood, whose bow was deep enough to betray ambition. Courtiers pressed forward in a delicate swarm. Margaret angled herself strategically, a ruby beacon among paler hues. Eliana stepped back. She would not compete. A gentleman approached her then, young and earnest, perhaps driven by pity. "Lady Eliana, might I?" His mother's fan snapped open behind him like a warning shot. The young man faltered, muttered an apology and withdrew. The rejection was small, almost courteous, yet it landed with the weight of inevitability. Margaret's voice floated again, honeyed and lethal. "You see, dear sister? Even kindness hesitates." The orchestra shifted into a waltz. Couples began to assemble, skirts whispering against polished stone. Margaret was claimed swiftly, her laughter bright as she swept into motion. Eliana remained where she was, an island of stillness amid revolving silk. She felt it before she saw it, the quiet disturbance of expectation, the subtle hush that precedes decision. King Alaric had disengaged from his circle. He was not smiling. He was walking. Not toward Margaret's crimson brilliance nor toward the cluster of titled beauties nearest the dais, but across the breadth of the ballroom, each measured step dissolving speculation into stunned silence. Conversations thinned. Fans lowered. Even the violins seemed to falter, bow against strings suspended in collective disbelief. Eliana's breath caught with unpracticed betrayal. Surely he intended to pass her, to address some lord position conveniently beyond her shoulder. She resisted the impulse to turn, to confirm an alternate destination that would spare her the humiliation of presumption. He did not pass. He stopped before her. Up close, his presence was not merely imposing, it was attentive. His eyes, far from the indifferent sweep she had expected, rested upon her face as though she were a text he meant to study carefully rather than dismiss. She became acutely aware of the faint tremor threatening her composure, of the way her gloved fingers tightened imperceptibly. "Lady Eliana Westwood," he said, his voice low, precise, and entirely unhurried. It was not a question. It was recognition. She inclined into a curtsy, measured and flawless. "Your Majesty." Around them the air strained. "I have been informed," he continued, "that this evening is devoted to displays of refinement." A faint murmur of agreement fluttered from nearby onlookers. "Then perhaps," he said, extending his hand, "we might test the claim." His palm remained open before her, an invitation offered without apology or spectacle. Margaret had stilled mid-turn across the floor. Lord Westwood's expression flickered between triumph and alarm. 100 gazes fastened upon the space between the king's hand and Eliana's. In that narrow distance lay every whisper ever spoken about her, every withdrawal, every polite evasion. If she refused, she preserved herself from greater scrutiny. If she accepted, she stepped directly into it. Eliana looked at his hand. For a heartbeat, she considered the old instinct, to retreat, to make herself small enough to escape notice. Instead, she felt the memory of fire along her skin, the heat that had once demanded courage without permission. Scars she knew were not erased by hiding them. She placed her gloved fingers in his. The contact was steady, unflinching. A collective intake of breath swept the hall. King Alaric's gaze did not waver as he drew her gently toward the floor. "You need not fear the room," he said quietly, though his words carried just enough to be heard. "It is I who have crossed it." And as the first notes of the waltz resumed, carrying them into the center of glittering scrutiny, Eliana understood that the evening had shifted irrevocably, not because a king had chosen her for a dance, but because he had chosen to be seen doing so. By morning, London had devoured the dance. What had transpired beneath Westwood Hall's chandeliers traveled faster than any carriage, slipping beneath breakfast doors with the Morning Post and perfuming drawing rooms with scandal before the tea had properly steeped. A king, newly arrived and dangerously unpromised, had crossed a ballroom not for a duchess or heiress, but for the unmarred sister no one wished to claim. Society did not forgive such defiance lightly. It embroidered it, exaggerated it, and pinned it upon the nearest available victim. Eliana felt the weight of that embroidery before she saw it. A small velvet parcel lay upon the escritoire in her chamber, placed there with ceremonious care. The curtains were half drawn against a pale winter sun, and the room still held the hush of early-hour restraint. She paused at the threshold, as though the object itself were capable of judgment. "No card accompanied it, my lady," her maid whispered. "Only the royal seal." The words pressed warmth and dread into equal measure. Eliana dismissed the girl gently and approached alone. The velvet was midnight blue, the sort favored by sovereign courts rather than English households. When she lifted the lid, the hinges released a breath of faint sandalwood. Inside rested a pair of gloves, finer than any she owned, ivory silk lined with the softest kid, the cuffs embroidered with silver thread so delicate it seemed spun from frost. She touched them cautiously. Along the inner seam, where no onlooker would think to search, a line had been stitched in restrained, masculine script. "For hands that have endured fire and yet remain unbroken." Her breath left her in a measured exhale she did not remember taking. It was not flattery. It was acknowledgement. The distinction trembled between them like a live wire. He knew. Or at least he had asked. Memory returned unbidden, the waltz unfolding beneath vaulted ceilings, the press of eyes against her back, the king's palm steady at her waist. He had not inquired about her scars, nor had he pretended ignorance. Instead, he had spoken of resilience as though it were currency more valuable than beauty. When she faltered beneath the scrutiny of the room, he had leaned closer and murmured, "Courage is rarely ornamental, Lady Eliana, yet it endures far longer than silk." She had not known whether to feel protected or exposed. A knock sounded briskly. Margaret entered without awaiting permission, her expression sharpened by curiosity poorly disguised as concern. I trust you have read the morning circulars, she began, closing the door behind her. One would think the fate of Europe rested upon your waltz. Eliana met her sister's gaze calmly. Does it? Margaret's lips tightened. Do not pretend innocence. His Majesty's attention is no small matter. Mother is already in conference with father. Alliances are fragile things. Am I an alliance? Eliana asked softly. You are a complication, Margaret replied, honesty flashing through practiced poise. And complications threaten ambition. Eliana looked back at the gloves in their velvet cradle. Or redirect it. Margaret followed her gaze, and for a moment something unguarded flickered in her eyes. Envy, perhaps, or unease. Gifts imply intention, she said. And intention invites scrutiny. Be certain you desire what you provoke. When she had gone, the room felt narrower. By afternoon, the invitation arrived. It was not written in elaborate flourish nor sealed with excessive grandeur. A simple request, conveyed through the royal chamberlain, that Lady Eliana attend the public garden reception at Kensington the following day. His Majesty would value her presence. Value. The word reverberated with perilous sweetness. Kensington Gardens bloomed despite winter's restraint, evergreen hedges carved into dignified forms, fountains casting silver arcs into cold air. Nobility gathered beneath pale skies, cloaks draped elegantly, conversation curated to appear effortless. Eliana felt the current of attention shift as she entered, as though every path had been waiting for her tread. She wore the new gloves. They fit as though measured by unseen hands. Whispers unfurled in her wake. Some admired her audacity, others dissected it. She recognized the expressions, curiosity sharpened by suspicion, politeness edged with hunger for spectacle. The garden, for all its cultivated serenity, felt like a stage. He stood near the central fountain, speaking with a cluster of diplomats, his dark coat catching the light like tempered steel. When he saw her, the conversation did not falter, yet something in his posture changed, an invisible alignment recalibrating toward her presence. He excused himself without haste. My lady, he said, inclining his head just enough to honor without diminishing. London appears invigorated. It thrives upon novelty, Your Majesty, she replied. I regret providing it such nourishment. On the contrary, he said quietly, his gaze dropping momentarily to her gloved hands, I find sustenance in defiance. A murmur rippled as he reached toward a nearby rosebush, winter-hardy and stubborn in its bloom. He plucked a single white rose and offered it to her, thorns unapologetically intact. Gasps feathered through the assembled company. Public gestures were currency more volatile than rumor. A king did not present flowers lightly, particularly not to a woman society had deemed unsuitable. Eliana accepted the rose, careful of its barbs. You risk much with symbolism, sire. He regarded her steadily. Risk clarifies intent. Across the lawn, she saw Lady Westwood speaking urgently with Margaret. Disapproval was a visible force, drawing lines in the air like battle formations. Your court will not approve, Eliana said. My court does not dictate my discernment, he replied, and there was steel beneath the velvet cadence. I have observed many hands extended to me in calculated grace. Few have borne the evidence of sacrifice. The word sacrifice struck deeper than flattery ever could. Sacrifice is seldom elegant, she said. Nor is sovereignty, he answered. For a suspended instant, the world seemed pared down to the space between them. The fountain's hush, the winter air crisp against her lungs, the rose cool in her grasp. He was not rescuing her. He was aligning himself beside her, and that distinction altered the axis of her fear. Then, from the stone steps bordering the garden, a voice carried sharp as frost. If His Majesty admires scars so profoundly, the Dowager Queen of Norhaven declared, her presence announced by the sudden bowing of courtiers, perhaps he will indulge the court by allowing us to behold them. Silence detonated. The rose trembled slightly in Eliana's hand. Around them, expectation tightened like drawn wire. The challenge was no longer whispered. It had been summoned into daylight, formal and irrevocable. King Alaric did not turn immediately. Instead, his gaze remained upon Eliana's gloved fingers, as though awaiting not society's verdict, but hers. The Dowager Queen's words did not echo, they settled. They fell across Kensington Gardens like a silken net drawn tight, catching every breath, every sidelong glance, every unvoiced appetite for spectacle. The fountain continued its measured hush, indifferent to humiliation, while nobles shifted with restrained anticipation. A challenge had been issued, not merely to a woman's modesty, but to a king's judgment. Eliana felt the weight of 100 unseen hands reaching for the edge of her gloves. If His Majesty admires scars so profoundly, perhaps he will indulge the court by allowing us to behold them. It was not curiosity. It was trial. She could have refused. No law compelled her compliance. Yet refusal would be interpreted as confirmation of shame, and compliance as surrender. The garden had transformed into a tribunal without walls. King Alaric's gaze did not stray from her. In it she found neither command nor pity, only a steady inquiry, as though he understood that sovereignty over one's own narrative could not be borrowed, even by a monarch. "My lady," he said quietly, pitched for her alone, "no audience may claim what you do not freely grant." The murmur around them sharpened. The Dowager Queen advanced a measured step, her silver hair coiled with immaculate severity beneath a hat of black silk. Her eyes, pale and incisive, regarded Eliana not as a rival but as an obstacle to be assessed. "In Norhaven," the Dowager observed, "transparency strengthens the throne." "In England," Alaric replied evenly, "so does restraint." The exchange was polite. It was also war. Eliana felt the rose's thorns press faintly against her palm, anchoring her to sensation. Fire had once stripped choice from her, reducing action to instinct. This was different. This demanded deliberation. She lifted her chin. "If the court desires spectacle," she said, her voice carrying with surprising clarity, "it will be disappointed. My scars are neither ornament nor entertainment." A few brows rose. A few lips curved with admiration they dared not display openly. The Dowager's expression did not alter. "Then you deny us the proof of His Majesty's discernment?" "I deny no one truth," Eliana answered. "I deny only the presumption that it is owed." For a heartbeat, silence swelled, perilous and magnificent. Then Alaric stepped closer, not shielding her but aligning himself unmistakably at her side. "My mother," he said with formal deference, "I require no exhibition to validate my judgment." "Judgment," the Dowager repeated, the word cool as marble. "Or infatuation?" The question landed with deliberate cruelty. Around them, society inhaled. Infatuation was forgivable. Principle was not. Alaric's jaw tightened, though his tone remained measured. "If I were governed by infatuation, I would have chosen ease. I do not." The admission rippled outward. Eliana felt the tremor of it in her own pulse. He had named the alternative plainly. He could have courted Margaret's glittering compliance or any number of unblemished heiresses eager to anchor themselves to a crown. Instead, he stood beneath public scrutiny for a woman whose very wrists were deemed liability. The Dowager's gaze shifted to Eliana's hands once more. "And what does Lady Westwood choose?" The inquiry was precise. It pierced beyond scandal into intent. Eliana understood then that this moment would follow her long after the garden emptied. If she hid, she would remain the fragile subject of defense. If she revealed, she would be reduced to spectacle. Neither path offered comfort. Only one offered ownership. Slowly, deliberately, she set the white rose upon the stone rim of the fountain. The movement drew every eye. She raised her hands, fingers steady despite the tremor coursing beneath skin. The silk of the gloves gleamed faintly in the winter light, immaculate and deceptive. 4 years they had been her armor, her concession to a world that equated smoothness with worth. She caught Alaric's gaze once more. He did not nod. He did not urge. He simply waited. Eliana hooked one finger beneath the edge of her right glove and drew it downward. The silk resisted slightly, then yielded, sliding over wrist and palm with a whisper soft enough to shame the hush of the fountain. Pale skin emerged, followed by the faint, branching tracery of old burns, delicate yet unmistakable. The scars were not grotesque. They were honest, like handwriting etched by flame. A murmur broke, subdued but irrepressible. She removed the second glove. Cold air kissed the exposed skin. For an instant, vulnerability surged sharp and electric, but it did not consume her. She did not lower her hands. She did not avert her eyes. "These," she said evenly, lifting her wrists for all to see, "were earned in saving a child from fire. If they offend delicate sensibilities, I recommend sturdier virtues." Shock flickered across several faces. Others flushed with reluctant respect. The Dowager studied her in silence, recalibrating. Alaric stepped forward then, the movement neither theatrical nor hesitant. He took Eliana's uncovered hands in his own, his grasp warm, unflinching. He did not conceal the scars within his palms. He elevated them as though presenting a standard rather than a flaw. "Norhaven," he said, his voice resonant now, carrying across clipped hedges and marble paths, was not built by perfection. It was built by those who endured. His thumb brushed lightly over the raised edge of one scar, an intimate acknowledgement that yet remained chaste before the assembly. I will not ask my future queen to apologize for survival. The word struck like thunder. Future queen. It hung in the air, luminous and perilous. Eliana's breath faltered, not from embarrassment, but from the enormity of what he had declared without ceremony. He had transformed scrutiny into proclamation. He had converted her trial into his own defiance. The dowager's composure thinned by a single degree. You presume much, Alaric? I declare intention, he answered. The garden had shifted irrevocably. What began as exposure had become assertion. Whispers no longer tasted solely of scandal, they carried the metallic tang of inevitability. Eliana felt the strange, intoxicating steadiness of standing unhidden. The scars did not vanish beneath his touch, they remained visible and incontrovertible. Yet in his grasp they no longer felt like liabilities awaiting judgment. They felt like history acknowledged. Still, beneath the surge of triumph, another awareness stirred. Intentions announced in public demand reckoning in private. As courtiers bowed stiffly and the dowager retreated with frostbitten dignity, Alaric did not release her hands. His gaze, fierce and searching, held hers with a question more dangerous than any accusation. Stand with me, he said softly, meant for her alone now, when the court demands proof of my resolve. The garden resumed its measured noise, but Eliana understood the true trial had only begun. The summons arrived at dusk, sealed not with wax alone but with consequence. A formal convocation of the court would convene at Norhaven House, the king's London residence, to address matters of succession and suitability. The phrasing was elegant, almost benign. Its implication was neither. Eliana read the document twice, feeling the parchment's faint texture beneath her fingertips, now unloved. Since the garden, she had not resumed the armor of silk. The exposure had altered something irrevocable within her. Yet boldness displayed beneath winter light would be tested more harshly beneath crystal chandeliers and ancestral portraits. When she entered Norhaven House the following evening, the air inside seemed tempered by history. Tall ceilings bore frescoed victories. Walls were lined with stern visages of monarchs whose eyes appeared to measure bloodlines with unforgiving precision. A long corridor led toward the great hall, where candlelight pooled in disciplined symmetry. King Alaric awaited near the threshold, dressed in formal black edged with silver braid. He did not greet her with flourish. Instead, his gaze traveled briefly to her uncovered wrists, then returned to her face with quiet approval. You come unshielded, he observed. I come as I am, she replied. A faint curve touched his mouth. That will suffice. Together they entered. The court assembled in deliberate ranks, nobles and advisers arrayed like a living tapestry of expectation. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, the Dowager Queen presided with austere composure. Margaret stood among the English contingent, her expression luminous with restrained anticipation, as though she watched a drama whose outcome she intended to claim. A chamberlain struck the floor once with his staff. His Majesty will address the court. Alaric stepped forward, though he did not release Eliana's presence from the room's awareness. My lords and ladies, he began, his voice steady as carved stone, you have expressed concern regarding my declared intention. A murmur stirred, polite but eager. I will not insult you by pretending the concern is unfounded, he continued. Marriage within the monarchy is not a private indulgence. It is a covenant with the future. The dowager inclined her head slightly, conceding the principle if not the conclusion. And yet, Alaric said, a covenant founded upon fear of imperfection is weaker than one forged through truth. An older lord rose from his place. Your Majesty, no one disputes Lady Eliana's courage. We question her suitability. A queen must embody ideal form. She must inspire unblemished loyalty. Eliana felt the word unblemished strike again, this time not as insult but as doctrine. Alaric regarded the speaker calmly. Is loyalty inspired by porcelain? He asked. Or by fortitude? Another voice joined, smoother, more insidious. Fortitude may be admired, sire, but scars invite distraction. The people are drawn to symbols. Precisely, Alaric replied. And what symbol is more honest than survival? The exchange tightened the air. Eliana sensed that rhetoric alone would not dissolve entrenched tradition. The court did not fear her past, it feared precedent. The dowager rose then, commanding silence with a glance. Alaric, she said, dispensing with formality, You propose to place a woman upon the throne whose very presence will challenge every portrait behind you. Consider the instability. He did not look at the portraits. I have considered it. And if instability follows? Then I will bear it. The simplicity of his answer reverberated. Eliana stepped forward before doubt could reclaim her. Your Majesty, she said, addressing not him but the assembled court, if instability arises, it shall not be because of my wrists. Every eye turned. I was not scarred through folly, she continued. I was scarred through duty. If that history disqualifies me from representing strength, then your definition of strength is fragile indeed. A sharp intake of breath answered her audacity. Margaret's composure faltered by a single blink. The dowager studied Eliana with new calculation. And would you accept, she asked coolly, that the throne may demand sacrifices beyond those you have already endured? Eliana felt the memory of flame brush her nerves, not as terror but as testament. I would accept that no crown can weigh more heavily than conscience. The hall quieted into something deeper than suspense. Alaric moved then, ascending the dais steps until he stood level with his mother. It was not an act of rebellion, it was alignment. He extended his hand toward Eliana once more, this time before the entire court. Lady Eliana Westwood, he said, his voice carrying to every carved corner, do you stand willing to share not only honor but burden? She met his gaze, seeing not the sovereign but the man who had crossed a ballroom and a garden alike. I do. He turned back to the assembly. Then hear me plainly. I will not barter integrity for convenience. I will not select a queen for the comfort of onlookers. I choose a partner who has faced fire and did not yield. The declaration settled like a standard planted in contested ground. The dowager's expression shifted, not into concession, but into contemplation. The court waited for her verdict as though legitimacy flowed solely from her approval. After a measured silence, she spoke. You may choose Alaric, she said. But understand this, the crown will test what you cherish. It will probe for fracture. If Lady Eliana falters beneath scrutiny, the consequence will not be confined to her. The warning was neither threat nor mercy. It was law. Eliana felt the magnitude of it settle across her shoulders. The trial would not end with acceptance. It would begin there. Alaric descended the dais and came to stand beside her once more. He did not clasp her hand this time. He allowed space as though recognizing that unity must not eclipse autonomy. The court has heard my intention, he said finally. Preparations for formal betrothal will commence. A wave of subdued astonishment swept the hall. Margaret's face drained of color, ambition unraveling in silent disbelief. Yet even as the assembly dispersed in fractured clusters of speculation, Eliana sensed that victory had not secured peace. The dowager's gaze lingered, thoughtful and unreadable. As candles guttered low and shadows lengthened across ancestral faces, Alaric leaned toward Eliana, his voice lowered to intimacy. They will watch you, he murmured. They will hope for misstep. She met his intensity without flinching. Then let them watch. Beyond the hall's tall windows, storm clouds gathered over London, their dark mass obscuring the first tentative stars. The storm broke before dawn, rattling the windows of Norhaven House as though the heavens themselves contested the king's decree. Rain streaked the glass in restless currents, blurring London into a wash of gray uncertainty. Within the dim quiet of her chamber, Eliana stood before the tall mirror, studying the reflection that society had weighed and found wanting. Her wrists were bare. In the softened light, the scars traced their pale signatures across her skin, neither grotesque nor delicate, simply present. They no longer startled her. What unsettled her now was the knowledge that by nightfall those same marks would be displayed beneath a cathedral's vaulted ceiling before nobles, diplomats, and a restless public hungry for triumph or failure. The formal betrothal ceremony had been announced with unambiguous authority. King Alaric would present his chosen queen before court and crown, binding intention to ritual. The dowager queen had offered neither endorsement nor obstruction. Her silence had become its own instrument of tension. A knock sounded, measured and familiar. Alaric entered without escort, dismissing protocol as though it were a coat he might shrug aside. He paused just within the threshold, taking in the quiet defiance of her uncovered wrists. The city anticipates spectacle, he said softly. Let it anticipate, she replied. It has done so since my childhood. He crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from her reflection. Today will not be another garden, he said. There will be no improvisation, no murmured defense. The ritual is rigid. Once spoken, the vows cannot be unspoken. She turned to face him fully. "Do you doubt?" His gaze did not waver. "I measure." The honesty steadied her more than any reassurance might have. "And what does your measure conclude?" "That I would rather be challenged beside you than admired beside another." The admission settled between them, intimate and resolute. By afternoon, Norhaven Cathedral shimmered beneath clearing skies, rain-washed stone luminous against the emerging blue. Carriages lined the approach in disciplined rows, liveried footmen assisting dignitaries whose expressions masked eager curiosity. The ceremony would be both declaration and examination. Inside, the nave glowed with candlelight that flickered along gilded arches and stained glass. Banners bearing the wolf emblem of Norhaven hung beside the English crest, an uneasy marriage of heraldry. At the altar stood the Dowager Queen, robed in midnight velvet, her posture as unyielding as carved granite. Eliana entered on her father's arm, though it was not paternal pride that stiffened his bearing, but the gravity of consequence. Her gown was white silk, severe in its elegance, sleeves ending just below the elbow. No gloves concealed her skin. Murmurs traveled like wind through dry leaves. She did not falter. Alaric awaited before the altar, crown absent yet authority unmistakable. When she reached him, he inclined his head, not in dominance but in recognition. The officiant began, voice resonant beneath vaulted stone, invoking lineage, duty, and the sacred covenant between sovereign and realm. Each phrase layered expectation upon expectation, until the air itself felt dense with obligation. When the time came for formal acknowledgement, the dowager stepped forward. "Before this union is sealed," she declared, her tone clear as winter air, "let the court witness not merely devotion but fortitude." The words reopened the wound of public scrutiny, though no glove separated Eliana now from judgment. A hush descended. Eliana lifted her hands deliberately, turning her wrists outward so candlelight traced the faint ridges of old fire. No tremor betrayed her. She had hidden once. She would not again. "These marks," she said, voice carrying with quiet strength, "were given in preservation of life. If they offend, let offense be measured against what they saved." Silence deepened, no longer eager but contemplative. Alaric stepped closer. Without spectacle, without hesitation, he took her scarred wrists gently in his hands. He did not conceal them. Instead, he raised them slightly as though presenting sacred relics rather than flaws. "These are not blemishes upon a throne," he said, his voice resonant beneath stone and stained glass. "They are proof that its future will be guarded by courage." Then, before assembled nobility and an unblinking court, he bent his head. His lips brushed the pale tracery of fire upon her skin. The gesture was neither theatrical nor hurried. It was reverent. A collective breath released, not in scandal but in astonished recognition. The act transformed spectacle into sanctification. Where society had sought humiliation, he offered honor. The dowager's gaze held steady, searching for weakness that did not materialize. At last, she inclined her head, not in surrender but in acknowledgement of resolve proven. The officiant resumed, voice steadier now, binding words into vow. Alaric spoke his promise without embellishment, to rule beside, to defend without diminishing, to honor without concealment. Eliana answered in equal measure, pledging not obedience but partnership. When the final blessing echoed through the nave, bells began to toll, their peals rolling outward across London's rooftops. As they turned to face the assembled court, Eliana felt not triumph but transformation. The central conflict had not vanished, it had evolved. Judgment would persist. Tradition would probe. Yet the axis of shame had shifted irrevocably into strength. Alaric leaned close enough that only she could hear. "They expected fracture," he murmured. "And?" she asked softly. "They witnessed foundation." Beyond the cathedral doors, the sky had cleared entirely, sunlight breaking through the last retreating clouds. As they stepped forward together, hand in hand, the crowd outside erupted into cheers that carried both relief and awe. Yet even amid acclaim, Eliana sensed the future's weight settling anew. A crown once placed would test more than scars. It would test resolve, unity, and the quiet spaces between public devotion and private doubt. Still, as bells thundered overhead and Alaric's grasp remained steadfast around her unhidden hands, she understood one immutable truth. The fire that had once marked her had not diminished her claim to light. The coronation was set for midsummer, when London shimmered beneath heat and expectation alike, and the city's anticipation had ripened into something perilously close to reverence. Yet reverence is a fragile thing, easily bruised by doubt, and doubt had not entirely relinquished its hold upon Norhaven's court. Eliana felt it in the way certain nobles bowed a fraction too stiffly, in the way conversations dimmed when she entered a room, in the way the Dowager Queen observed without interference yet without surrender. The cathedral that had witnessed her betrothal now stood adorned in heavier splendor. Crimson banners cascaded from stone pillars, threaded with gold that caught the sun like living flame. The Wolf of Norhaven glinted above the high altar, fierce and unyielding. Outside, thousands gathered, their cheers rolling like distant thunder through the open doors. Inside, silence reigned, sharpened by ritual. Eliana stood robed in white and silver, the coronation mantle resting across her shoulders with solemn weight. The fabric was exquisite, hand-embroidered with symbols of unity and endurance. Its sleeves ended just below her elbows. Her scars were visible. This had not been an oversight. Alaric had insisted upon it with quiet certainty when tailors hesitated. "The realm will not be governed by concealment," he had said. "Let it see what it entrusts with power." Now he stood beside her in ceremonial black and crimson, crownless for the final moments before consecration. His expression bore the gravity of command, yet beneath it she sensed the pulse of something more vulnerable, awareness that this ceremony would seal not only their union but their defiance. The officiant's voice rose, resonant and ancient, recounting lineage, invoking duty, binding past to future in phrases heavy with tradition. Eliana listened without distraction. She had spent her life bracing against judgment. Today she would stand within it. When the moment came for the Queen's oath, she stepped forward alone. The hall seemed to narrow, every gaze converging upon her uncovered wrists as though expecting them to tremble. The Dowager Queen sat directly ahead, inscrutable as marble. Margaret stood among foreign dignitaries, her expression composed but strained, as though she balanced between admiration and the remnants of rivalry. Eliana drew a measured breath. "I stand before you," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, not as an emblem of perfection but as proof of endurance. A ripple moved through the assembly. "I was shaped by fire," she continued, lifting her hands slightly, the pale tracery illuminated by candlelight. "I was judged for it. I was diminished for it. Yet I did not break." Her words were not accusation, they were declaration. "If I am to wear this crown, it shall not be because I satisfy comfort. It shall be because I embody resilience. Let the realm understand that its queen does not hide from history. She bears it." Silence deepened into something almost sacred. Alaric watched her not as sovereign assessing subject, but as partner witnessing strength. In his gaze there was pride but also relief that she required no rescue. The officiant turned to him. "Your Majesty, do you affirm this woman as your equal in burden and in power?" Alaric stepped forward, his voice resonating against vaulted stone. "I do not elevate her to soften my reign," he said. "I elevate her because she strengthens it." The dowager's eyes flickered, a nearly imperceptible shift from scrutiny toward acceptance. The crown was brought forth then, borne upon velvet by the archbishop. It gleamed with ancient authority, its weight symbolic and literal. Before it could descend upon Eliana's head, the officiant paused. "Does any voice contest this union of crown and queen?" The question hung in the cathedral like suspended breath. For a heartbeat, no sound answered. Then, from among the assembled lords, a single figure stepped forward. Lord Harrington, a staunch traditionalist whose loyalty to precedent rivaled devotion to crown. "Your Majesty," he began, bowing with rigid formality, "I do not contest her character. I contest the message. A realm must project invulnerability. Scars, however noble, signal fracture." Murmurs stirred. Alaric's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Eliana did. "Fracture," she repeated softly. "Is a realm invulnerable when it denies its own trials?" Harrington met her gaze, unflinching. "Perception shapes allegiance." "Then let perception evolve," she replied. "If the people see a queen who has endured and stands unashamed, they will know their suffering does not disqualify them from dignity." The cathedral absorbed her words. Harrington hesitated, not convinced but unsettled. "And if they see weakness?" Alaric's voice cut through, firm and resonant. "Then they will see weakness in me as well, for I stand beside her." The declaration shifted the axis of debate. It was no longer her alone under scrutiny, it was the king's resolve intertwined with hers. Harrington bowed once more, slower this time. "Then may your shared strength justify this risk." He stepped back. No further voices rose. The archbishop lifted the crown. As it descended, Eliana felt not the chill of metal but the warmth of culmination. The circlet settled against her brow, heavy yet stabilizing. A murmur swelled into applause, cautious at first, then surging as realization took root. Alaric received his own crown moments later, and when he turned to her, their gazes locked in silent acknowledgement of the path traversed, from ballroom humiliation to sovereign affirmation. The officiant proclaimed them king and queen of Norhaven. The cathedral erupted. Yet amid the acclaim, Eliana sensed a final reckoning awaited, not from nobles or foreign dignitaries, but from the Dowager Queen, whose silence had been the story's quiet undertone. When the assembly began to kneel, the Dowager remained standing. For an instant, tension crackled anew. Then, with deliberate grace, she descended the dais steps and approached her newly crowned son and daughter-in-law. The hall watched breathless. She stopped before Eliana. Up close, the Dowager's eyes were no longer cold, they were measuring something deeper. "You have altered the image of this throne," she said, voice low but carrying. "Alteration invites instability." Eliana held her gaze steadily. "Or growth." A faint pause. Then, slowly, the Dowager inclined her head, not to the crown but to the woman beneath it. "Then let it be growth," she said. The gesture was subtle yet seismic. With it, the last visible resistance dissolved. Outside, bells thundered, echoing across London's rooftops. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, igniting color across stone and silk alike. The wolf emblem gleamed above them, no longer a solitary standard but part of a united silhouette. Alaric reached for Eliana's hand, not lifting it in display, but intertwining his fingers with hers in quiet solidarity. "They will remember this day," he murmured. "They will remember what they witnessed," she replied. "And what was that?" She looked out over the kneeling court, over the sea of faces that had once whispered and now bowed. "That strength does not require concealment." The applause swelled again, no longer fractured but unified. It rolled through the cathedral doors and into the waiting city, where cheers answered in thunderous accord. As they stepped forward to greet their realm, Eliana felt the mantle settle more comfortably upon her shoulders. The scars upon her wrists caught the light, no longer symbols of doubt, but emblems of transformation. And in that blazing convergence of crown, courage, and choice, the fire that had once marked her completed its final transfiguration, no longer a wound to be hidden but a legacy to be worn.